Hello, everyone. It's Clay Jenkinson. This is my introduction to this week's podcast. This is a conversation between Thomas Jefferson and David Horton. David Horton of Radford University in Virginia, my dear friend. He often guest hosts the program. He does a great job. We talked about Mr. Jefferson and diplomacy. So diplomacy, Jefferson as president, Jefferson as Secretary of State, Jefferson as the American minister to France, the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson and Cuba, Jefferson and tariffs, Jefferson and trade policy, all topical issues, but we stayed completely within Jefferson's time and character on that. The American people knew who Donald Trump was when he stood for re-election in 2024, and he was handily re-elected, both in the Electoral College and the popular vote. That matters. There's no way to avoid that, and he's entitled by that victory to attempt within our constitutional system of checks and balances to pursue his policies, his vision, if you can call it that, his purposes in the world. He has every right to do what he wants to do if it's not checked under our system by the Congress or by the courts or by the demands of the American people. State governments, of course, will play a role in that, too. That was what Jefferson believed when he wrote the Kentucky Resolutions in 1798, that in certain moments the states have to stand up to the federal government if the federal government refuses to follow the rule of the Constitution. For anyone offended by that, I apologize, but I just ask that you hear and heard me when I repeatedly said, look, we probably needed a shakeup. Some of the grievances are grounded in reality. Tough love may be necessary. That doesn't condone the crudeness of the hate and the aggression and the vindictiveness. I think that's never okay. I do think that we all must realize that we had every right to refuse to reelect him in 2024, but he was reelected, and that matters. I also promote several times in the course of this podcast Robert Kagan's book, The Jungle Grows Back. It's a really important book, but what it basically says is that the peaceful post-World War II world order of prosperity and relative harmony in Europe is an amazing achievement brought on by Europe and the United States, the EU, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the World Bank, that after the devastations of the 20th century, led by the United States, but partly also by Europe, the world moved towards a system of adjudicating differences without blood. And it survived until 2014, more or less. There were many skirmish wars, and of course there was Iraq and Afghanistan and other failed policies. Is Iraq better off without Saddam Hussein? Is Afghanistan better off for our 20 years there? Do the math. But if we withdraw from that, says Robert Kagan, we may release the nightmare of the 20th century all over again. And so we'll see. It's a really interesting time, and I'm trying to come at it with an open mind. I don't like incivility in any of its forms. I do, however, believe that sometimes a shakeup is necessary and tough love can be necessary. We'll see what happens in the economy. We'll see what happens in our foreign relations. We'll see what happens with respect to Canada, the Gulf of Mexico, Panama, and Greenland. We'll see whether we stay in NATO, and if so, whether we continue to support it. I could imagine us trying to withdraw from the United Nations. It just seems to me that we're living in a really interesting, volatile time of shakeup, and that's always anxiety-producing. So we'll see if something good comes of this. I think we have to be patient here. On the other hand, I think we need to speak our minds, and I think incivility in any of its forms is a bad idea for the government of the United States. Anyway, that's this week's program. Thomas Jefferson on diplomacy, Thomas Jefferson on trade and tariffs, Thomas Jefferson on Cuba, Thomas Jefferson on what he called an empire for liberty such as the world has never previously seen, and then a careful tiptoeing through the crisis situation in the world And I apologize to anyone who's offended, but you hear me, I hope, when I say, I get it. I get it. I get the problems, and I get that elections matter. Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton. I have the honor of serving as your guest co-host this week from Radford University in Radford, Virginia. And joining me today to begin our program is the third President of the United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, but also for this program, maybe most importantly for today's discussion, the first United States Secretary of State. Mr. President, welcome. It is so good to see you once again.
Good day to you, citizen.
So, Mr. President, I'm a Virginian just as you were. I'm very interested in international diplomacy, international relations. And when this nation was founded, you were sort of given the task of creating the structure for international relations. Could you share a little bit about how all that sort of came to be in the role of the Secretary of State in helping the United States connect with other parts of the world?
You may be giving me more credit than I deserve, citizen, but let me explain what I can. So, in 1784, I went to France to serve as the American minister there. I was there for 5 years. I came back in November of 1789 with my daughter, both daughters, Martha and Maria, because I wanted to replace them into Virginia. I was afraid that they were spending too much time away from the United States and they might forget their origins. When I got to shore in Norfolk, I learned that there was a letter waiting for me, and I learned that President Washington, the new president, had nominated me as Secretary of State without consulting me, and that the Senate had approved my position. I didn't particularly want to be part of the government. I was hoping to go back to France. I was fascinated by the French Revolution. It was the most important global event after our revolution, and it was indebted to the work that we did between 1774 and 1783. But I wasn't really in a position to turn down George Washington, and so I didn't go back. I never went back to Europe. I sent letters of apology. I closed out my home in Paris. I had 80 crates of things sent back and so on. Mrs. Patsy, my elder daughter, was married in the spring of 1790. And after that, I made my way to the new capital, to the first capital of the United States, New York City, and took up my post. So that's the background story. It wasn't clear what the Secretary of State would do. I knew that diplomacy would be part of it, of course, but it was also sort of designed by George Washington to be a grab bag. The patent office would be in the office of the Secretary of State and a whole range of other domestic things. I didn't want so large a portfolio. In a sense, the Secretary of State was going to be the prime minister. And so I did what I could to restrain his vision of that office. I served for about 3 years. I found it excruciatingly unpleasant. Not working with George Washington, that was fine. But having to share that cabinet with Alexander Hamilton, loud, bold, aggressive, trampling on other people's portfolios, working behind my back to undermine the official diplomacy of the United States government. I asked George Washington to let me resign again and again, and I finally did. It was just too much tension. I don't like conflict. I shrink from conflict. So I served in that post as America's first Secretary of State.
So as Secretary of State, in addition to all the things you talked about, can you share a little bit with us about your thoughts on international relations, diplomacy, how the United States began to form relationships with countries around the world, and how we dealt with folks that we saw as our adversaries at that time?
It was a pretty small world for us, sir. We were still in great tension with Britain. The war had ended. There had been a peace treaty in Paris in 1783, but there was still a great deal of conflict, especially in economic terms. The British were required under the provisions of the treaty to vacate their forts in the Ohio country and in the Great Lakes country. They did not. They were required to return slaves that they had captured or slaves that had run to them during the war. They did not. So there were all sorts of loose ends that we had to try to work out, and I spent a great deal of my time trying to get Britain to be honorable. Now, they would say, if they were here, that we refused to pay some of our revolutionary debts. They had their own views of why the treaty was not fulfilled. So that was one thing that I did. France was our ally, of course. We had signed a treaty of amity and friendship and commerce and mutual security with France in 1778. That was Dr. Franklin's great achievement. And so our relations with France were on the whole very good. Beyond that, there wasn't much to talk about. Spain, of course. Spain held much of South America, much of Central America, Mexico, the Floridas, what's in your time the American Southwest. And we wanted them off the continent, but at the time, I felt that Spain was not an issue, that they were a declining world power, that they were essentially impotent, that it was fine by us if they held that territory until such time as we were ready to take it. So that was the essential portfolio had. There was one really alarming incident during my time as Secretary of State, and that's it's an obscure bit of history, but it's called the Nootka Sound controversy. This was on the coast north of your Seattle. Both Britain and Russia and Spain claimed that part of the world. And when the British occupied or landed on Nootka Sound, the Spanish flared up, and it looked like there would be war. It looked like it would be a very serious world war, and that we would almost inevitably be drawn into it. And the British actually approached the Washington administration asking for permission to march across America from the east to get to Nootka Sound to defend their interests there. We refused, of course. We decided to stay neutral in that war. And then just finally one more thing that was huge, and that is America attempting to stay neutral during the French Revolution. We supported the revolution up to a point, but we didn't want to get caught up in the wars that Napoleon was beginning to prosecute. I thought we should commit ourselves to the future of France because of the Treaty of 1778 and our gratitude for what they had done for us. Our independence was achieved sooner and less expensively in every term, thanks to the intervention of France and the loans that they gave us. But Washington wanted strict neutrality, and this was one of the first times that he and I disagreed on a fundamental question. Of course, my duty was to acquiesce, which I reluctantly did, but I felt that we were betraying France. They had come to our aid. Without France, it's not clear we would have been independent anytime soon, in the long run, of course. And now for us to declare neutrality offended France deeply and worsened our relations, which I took to be tragic.
That's a very interesting point because, again, just as a layperson who is very interested in your work over the course of your professional political life, and then the American values that were established following the revolution here and what we based our Declaration and our Constitution on and all of that, it always appeared to me throughout history that we tended to support those peoples that were more democratic in nature, republic in nature, as opposed to monarchies and authoritarian governments, things along that line. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit, with the caveat that, of course, at this time, there were monarchies that we had to deal with that we didn't have any other option, but certainly that as America sowed the seeds of revolution around the world, America sort of supported that ideal as we dealt with folks internationally.
It's a complicated issue, really. I'm an isolationist. I'm thrilled that we have a 3,000-mile ocean between us and Europe. This will always protect us from the madness and the havoc and the wars of Europe. And the more we turn away from the old world and look on the new world as a kind of independent fortress, the happier and more secure we will be. I wanted to have as few embassies and diplomatic headquarters around the world as possible. It seems to me that diplomacy is important, of course, but it often stirs up more trouble than it solves. And I really wanted us, as a new experimental republic committed to freedom and liberty and equality wherever possible, I wanted us to turn our back on European history and on Europe itself. But of course, you can't make that happen. You have to live in the world. New England was dedicated to trade, shipping, international insurance, etc. And so our merchant ships were going to go all over the world, and that means that there were going to be incidents, there were going to be difficulties. Sailors would be arrested in foreign ports for crimes they may or may not have committed. The Tripolitan Islamic pirates of North Africa were seizing our sailors in internationally free waters. There will always be issues of contraband and smuggling. And so I understood that once you create a merchant fleet, there will be incidents, and they must be then handled at the highest levels. And therefore you need some foreign consuls, and you need diplomats in our national capital in New York, later Philadelphia, later Washington, D.C., to handle those things. So this meant we probably had to have a navy, and suddenly you're being drawn into the vortex of all the madness and chaos and the tragedy of European history. So I was worried about this all of my life. I think that America's best promise is to stay as isolated as we possibly can be. But since the genius of our people was for trade, we needed to establish enough of a Army, Navy, War Department to protect us from what inevitably would occur in international waters and the hostility of the British. I always lamented that trade was going to be, in a sense, the Satan that would come into our agrarian paradise and make us force us to have a stronger government.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up trade, because in our next segment, right after we take a break, I'd like to talk a little bit about trade and tariffs and how that affects international relationships, as well as revenue and other services, and how it impacts the American people. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. Welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. This is David Horton. I have the honor of serving as your guest host this week from my studio here in Radford, Virginia, on the campus of Radford University. And joining me today, we are having a fascinating conversation with the very first Secretary of State of the United States, the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. Mr. President, thank you once again for joining us. And just before we had to take a break, we were talking about trade. Could you share some additional thoughts on trade policy and philosophy, and how those might be similar and how those might be different?
Well, because we were the United States, even in my time, we owned everything up to the Rocky Mountains after the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, the Mississippi Valley is probably the most fertile river valley in the world, drained by tributaries, which also were exceedingly fertile. So we had advantages that no other nation in history has ever had. We had lead mines, we had, if we needed them, gold and silver mines, we had salt mines. We could grow all of our own food and more and produce it for export. We had timber. We had forests that stretched all the way to the Rocky Mountains, essentially an infinite amount of lumber if we wished to cut any of those forests down. So we had tremendous advantages, and we could be self-sufficient. There was nothing, frankly, that we needed. We grew wheat and rice and potatoes and oats and so on. We had a huge population of horses and could proliferate horse herds at will. So we had these extraordinary advantages. So what do we really need from Europe? Well, nothing. What do we want from Europe? Well, fine wines. I certainly want fine wines. They can't be produced here. Not yet, anyway. China, finished furniture, certain types of lace, silk scarves. There are things that we wanted, but we wanted them, but we didn't need them. And every time we got into deep conflict with Britain or France, I suggested that we turn inward and dress in homespun and return to a kind of a fortress economy. However, I've already admitted that the genius of the American people, especially of New England, is for trade. So here's my philosophy. We should trade those things we have in surplus and Europe wants, tobacco, indigo, rice, rum, whatever, timber, in exchange for things that Europe has in surplus and we want. It should be that simple. And the less that money gets involved in this, the better. Letters of credit, I prefer to actual exchanges of currencies and so on. And we should try to minimize all this trade. And we should have, I'm an advocate of free trade. In other words, I disagree with tariffs of any sort. We should have trade relations with other countries on a most favored nation basis. So whatever the most favored nation is, let's say it's France, then every other country should be able to have the same trade advantages as long as they play fairly in the economic arena. The problem, sir, is that we were free traders, but Europe was mercantilist. In other words, the governments controlled their economies and they used tariffs to protect industries in their countries and to avoid foreign competition. Well, if that's going to happen, if France is going to place impossible tariffs on our tobacco, which they did, a lot of my work as the American minister to France was to try to reduce or eliminate those tariffs on our tobacco. If they're going to do that, if they're going to be protectionist, we have to retaliate. We have to counter that. We can't just absorb all of that. And so I wanted the world to move towards free trade. I pushed for it. I advocated. I wrote a model treaty with the help of John Adams that we presented to a number of European nations, and they all rejected it, except Prussia, and Prussia wasn't trading much with us. So I'm a free trader, but I live in a world of mercantilism and protectionism. I tried to keep our tariffs, our retaliatory economic policies as minimal as possible. And I look forward to a time when every nation on earth, every ministry of every nation understands that the freer the trade, the better it works. I don't need to remind you, sir, of what Adam Smith taught us, that there is a willing buyer and a willing seller. If suddenly there is a perceived need in Europe for new ships and they don't have forests to produce that timber, they're going to turn to some country that does have those forests, to Canada or to the United States. We then will trade that timber with as low regulatory apparatus as possible, and they will then send us something that we don't have, perhaps fine wines, whatever it might be. This is the ideal. It bothers me greatly that the world couldn't see this. What I had to learn in my life is I'm essentially I'm an idealist bordering on a utopian, but when you live in the real world, you realize that other nations don't share our enlightenment, and you still have to live in that world. So my policies were a little bit less committed to free trade than my philosophy, but if I could have prevailed with those nations, there would have been no tariffs anywhere in the world.
Yeah, unfortunately, from what I've read, and again, I'm just a layperson on this and certainly give to your expertise here, is that really from the 1790s throughout the 19th century, we experienced tremendous protectionism as we tried to trade with other nations and had to retaliate. And in fact, that resulted in the vast majority of any federal revenue that existed throughout the 1800s. Can you speak to that and speak to where that revenue can become somewhat addictive to the federal government and perhaps even become the reason for other tariffs to exist, not just to protect certain industries or to allow them to mature, but can become its own end goal?
I think that's a bad idea, bad economic policy. It drives up prices for those who need to purchase whatever wares they need to secure their lives and to feed their families. So it's a hidden tax, and I'm against all hidden taxes. I think our taxes should be transparent. In other words, if the government of the United States needs $10 million per year, as it did during my 2 terms as president, The people should know where that money is coming from and how it's being gathered, and they should have to understand their own contribution to the success of that government. If you create a series of hidden taxes, the people don't have the knowledge they need to punish Congress for overtaxing them. And so I want transparency, and I don't want tariffs to hand on a hidden tax to the people. And it also violates Adam Smith's principle. As you know, that the great Scottish economist, the first great economist, said that if you just leave it alone, if government stays out of it, if you just let the economy percolate under its own dynamics, it works in a kind of magical way. He said there's almost a magical hand at work. And whenever government involves itself in the economy and doing some of the legerdemain that you're talking about, it distorts the economy, it drives up prices, it makes it less efficient for the exchange of goods and services, takes out the natural market, it makes it impossible for goods and services to reach their actual market cost. In other words, if you artificially prop up the tobacco economy, then you are veering farther and farther away from nature and nature's law. And at some point, you're going to pay a huge price for that gap.
So what was the end result throughout the course of your time as Secretary of State and as President as we engaged in trade and tariffs and other things with diplomacy in terms of our relationships with the world? How did that set the world order at that time with who our allies were and who our adversaries were?
It's a great and complicated question. Let me say, first of all, that I believe that time is on our side. That's my entire philosophy of diplomacy. My approach to all diplomatic questions was, in a sense, to stall. We knew we were going to get the Floridas if we just waited. By the Floridas, I mean not just your state of Florida, but the Gulf Coast. Mm-hmm. We knew we were going to take Texas at some point. We knew that we would eventually be an empire for liberty that spread from the Atlantic all the way to the mouth of the Columbia River or to California. This was clear. The dynamic of the American people is unstoppable. No European nation in the end was ever going to be able to prevent us from infiltrating the entire continent. They knew this, we knew this. That's why Napoleon sold us the Louisiana Territory, because he knew that eventually we would take it anyway. So I'm an optimist. Time is on our side. During the crisis in my second term, what's known as the embargo crisis, when we were being sort of ground up between the war juggernauts of France and England, there was a widespread belief that we should go to war. I refused to do so. I said we need a tertium quid, we need a third path, and that third path was economic embargo, a total embargo of everything in and everything out. Let's just become Fortress America. So that's the approach that I tended to take to all of these things. Time is on our side, and eventually the United States will become so wealthy and so powerful and so large that the world will quake in looking across the Atlantic at us, and nobody will dare affront us because of our sheer power, coupled with ethical and moral right. In other words, we weren't going to become another swashbuckling empire. We were going to be an empire for liberty, such as the world has never previously seen. And so I always approached it that way, and my critics would be clamoring for me to act, do something. Take the Louisiana Territory crisis. France and Spain were trading Louisiana Territory back and forth, could never keep up with their diplomacy, and the Spanish Entente closed the Mississippi River. An illegal act under natural law. We had as much right to that river as any other nation. It was, after all, the western border of the United States after 1783. But they closed it. And so from the west, from Kentucky and Western Virginia and the Ohio Valley, petitions and demands that I do something, go to war, send troops, do something, Mr. President. And they became very frustrated when I didn't, because I wanted to play a long game. And I assumed that things would fall our way, and eventually they did. I sent James Monroe, one of my principal protégés, over to Paris to work with Robert Livingston, our minister there, to see if we could buy the lower Mississippi River, buy a port like New Orleans. That's when Napoleon, desperate for funds, despairing of his attempt to recolonize the New World, suddenly decided to sell us 575 million acres, 828,000 square miles, for 3 cents per acre. If I had followed Mr. Hamilton's lead, I would have invaded New Orleans with troops. Blood would have been shed. And so my goal was to see if I could outlast some of these crises. That frustrated a lot of people because they wanted a sort of man on horseback, a kind of Hamiltonian figure, or an Aaron Burr or somebody of that stamp. I'm just not organized that way. And so I had what some historians have called a feline, a cat-like stealth diplomacy. And it worked. And it also worked in the embargo crisis. We did impose a total embargo in 1807, 8, and 9. It was very hard to enforce here. There was a lot of smuggling. I was burned in effigy in some New England port towns. It forced me to take more power as president than I ever wanted, just to enforce these embargo acts. But I assumed it was much better than going to war with Britain. We weren't really ready for war, and I also think it's too late in the world's history to solve disputes of this sort through bloodshed. And in the long run, we prevailed. It did take the War of 1812. And I'll say this, I wouldn't say this, I'm going to be really cautious. I want to almost whisper, sir, but if I had been president of the United States in 1812, I think I could have avoided that war.
That was something I was just going to ask you, immediately following your time in the White House. It was a tumultuous time. There was challenge. As you reflected back in your post-presidential years, do you feel like your policies and your thoughts and your actions or lack of action or your subtle actions benefited America during that time with regard to international relations?
I do think so. I think by balancing the budget and eliminating 37% of the national debt, I made us solvent, so if we had to go to war, we would have the wherewithal to do it. I'm against the national debt, of course. By stalling on some of these questions, I gave us time to build our economy. By the time I left the presidency on March 4th, 1809, our economy was so strong that we were now better prepared for whatever would come in the Madison and later the Monroe administrations. And so, again, I always believed that time was on the side of the New World. Time was on the side of the United States. But I will tell you this, sir, and I need to be candid. A lot of this depended upon luck. Napoleon wouldn't have had to give us the Louisiana Territory for 3 cents per acre. Britain could have been much more hostile to us than it was. The French Revolution could have engulfed us more completely than it eventually did. I was very lucky, and I don't want to downplay that. I did not want the Louisiana Territory. I was glad to have it when it came, but I really only wanted to secure the Mississippi River as our artery of commerce and maybe get the Floridas at that time. I sort of also wanted Cuba, by the way. But I didn't really plan to double the size of the United States, and frankly, I thought the Louisiana Purchase was technically unconstitutional. So when I look back on my foreign policy, I believe that it was the right one. I believe that I was right as an Enlightenment philosophe to believe that war is madness and that it's too late in the world's history to solve our disputes through bloodshed. But I also believe that we were deeply fortunate to have a 3,000-mile ocean between us and the shores of France and England and Spain, and we were very fortunate in the way things fell out. I was also lucky in that during my first term was much more successful than my second, because in my second term, France and Britain went at each other's throats in an existential crisis, a world war. In my first term, there was the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, and that meant from 1802, 3, and 4, there was peace in the world. And during that time, we built up our national wealth. Our trade ships began to ply the world's waters. There was a period of great economic optimism in the United States. But then in 1805, Napoleon decided to go back to war, and that's when the real trouble began, and it bedeviled my second term. I was unpopular for a period of time because of the embargo that I attempted, and here's what really bothers me, sir. I so believe in the American people. Of all the founding fathers, I'm the one that really believes in the American people most. I'm not a Democrat, but I'm I certainly believe in a democratic republic. In other words, a universal white manhood suffrage and so on. When the American people smuggled during the embargo crisis and protested violently at times, I was a little disappointed in them for the first time because they didn't understand we had only three choices here. War, which is a ruinous choice. Surrender, just to let Napoleon and Great Britain manhandle us on the open seas, impress our sailors, remove goods from our ships, sink ships, fire on ships. Option one, war. Option two, surrender. Neither one of those is acceptable, of course. Of course, no president could ever accept either one of those. And so I thought a total economic embargo is not perfect, of course, but it's the best chance we have because we have a unique advantage over all other nations. We're America. We have the abundance. And so it bothered me that the American people didn't realize that our liberty is more important than profit or short-term commercial success. And I didn't lose respect for the American people, but it was the first time that I felt a real disappointment in them.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is always so enlightening to sit down and talk with you and to reflect on our world today through the lens of your time and your actions and your thoughts. When we come back after this quick break, we'll sit down with Clay Jenkinson and unpack some of this thought on diplomacy, trade, and tariffs. This is Listening to America. Good day, friends, and welcome back to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm David Horton. I have the honor of serving as guest host with you this week as I am here in Radford, Virginia. And joining me now after a fascinating conversation with President Jefferson is noted, world-renowned, world-traveling humanities scholar, Clay Jenkinson. Clay, how are you, my friend?
Famous in several counties. I'm fine. I just back from Cuba. I took a cultural tour to Cuba. This is the second time I've done so. 10 days. We went across the entire island from Santiago in the east, where the revolution began in 1953, the Castro Revolution, all the way to the Bay of Pigs, which was the worst foreign policy debacle of the Kennedy administration, April 17th through 19th, 1961, and finally ending up in Havana, where we spent 3 days, and we had extraordinary experiences there. It's one of the most harmonious, thoughtful, curious, well-intentioned groups I've ever had the chance to be a part of. And Russ and Liz Eagle were our local, they're the facilitators of all of this. And Wayne Fairchild, who does the summer Lewis and Clark trips, has become fascinated by Cuba, and so he made it all happen for us. It was a great journey. I've been traveling more or less continuously since January 1st. I'm a little weary, but this is the nature of things. And if you get a chance to go to Cuba, I urge everyone to do so. And please read what I put on our site, ltamerica.org. I have a proposal for the future of Cuba in a nutshell. We need to lift the embargo. The embargo has been on for 64 years. It had two purposes, my friend. One was to force the Castro regime to liberalize or dissolve. That didn't happen. And secondly, if that didn't work, then to put so much pain on the shoulders of every citizen of Cuba that they would eventually force change within. That didn't happen. In fact, it worked the other way. So, Einstein's definition of insanity. It's time to lift the embargo. President Obama tried to do it in 2016. President Trump slammed the door again the minute he became president, and has done it again this time the minute he became president. It's insane. And the people of Cuba are good and decent people. They are friendly, generous, cheerful, resolute, resilient. They have infinite patience. They're suffering in ways that no American would ever want to suffer economically. We were handing out bars of soap to them on the street, and they were grateful to have soap. So we need to completely rethink our relationship with Cuba. It could be a very dear friend. I have no idea why we continue to hold the embargo, except that there are 2 million expat Cubans in Miami, and they want us to keep pressing the boot on the neck of the Raul Castro regime. Raul is 93. I doubt that he's doing much day-by-day governing. But anyway, that was Cuba. It was great. Glad to be back. And now I'm preparing to go to Moab on April 3rd and 4th to perform two of my favorite characters. John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran who floated the Colorado Canyons in 1869 and became America's first water czar. And then J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. And so all of that. And finally, I urge people to sign up for our September 21st through 27th John Steinbeck retreat in the Monterey Bay that's now up on the website. So lots and lots and lots is going on, my friend.
And so busy and so fascinating. And, we talk about lots going on. There's been lots going on in January, February, and March of 2024.
Really? I missed it all. I've been gone. Have there been some news developments in this country?
So I thought it would be interesting today for us to begin with Mr. Jefferson, talking about the origins of diplomacy in the United States, how much of our initial foundation based on the American ideal really formed a lot of our diplomatic relationships, how trade and tariffs were impacting things, particularly at the time for a new nation where so many industries were truly in their infancy, not in any level of maturity, and growing from there. In the past 90 days, not even 90 days at the time of this recording, we've seen so many changes to international relationships, both through direct foreign policy, through direct trade change, and through direct tariffs, and an alignment readjustment that I don't believe we've seen for about 70 or 80 years, at least since the World War II era. Could you reflect a little bit on that? And maybe we talk a little bit about what's happening and kind of what Jefferson told us.
So Jefferson and President Trump share some views, kind of America first, less engagement with the old world. He talked in his first term about endless wars and how we should avoid them and so on. So there are some ways in which Jefferson, Pat Buchanan, and Donald Trump share a certain view of this. But keeping in mind, Jefferson lived 200 plus years ago. He wouldn't hold the same views today, surely, that he held then. But if we hold him to those views, he's certainly an isolationist, an America firster. Just a quick sort of background on this, David, and thanks for being the guest host. I always love it when we work together. Hope we do more. Robert Kagan has a book called The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World, and I strongly urge everyone to read it. The Jungle Grows Back, easy to remember, America and Our Imperiled World. Wrote this about 10 years ago. He said, look, the history of Europe is the history of madness. The 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the Reformation, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the War of Spanish Succession, World War I, World War II, the Franco-Prussian War. It's all madness. It's all madness. You have all these nation states and all these ethnic groups clutching together on this continent, speaking different languages, having different religious sensibilities or doctrines, different economic systems. And they have been at each other's throats. World War I killed 40 million people. World War II killed equally that number. After all of that, after all that madness, the United States stepped in as one of the victors of the two world wars and said, look, we've got to figure out something here. And we didn't do it alone, of course. Europe led this. And so they created the European Economic Community to allow free trade within Europe, so they would be able to have an economy that could stand up to the giants, the USSR and the giant, the United States. And then came NATO as a way to guarantee sovereignty and security amongst European nations. The Marshall Plan, in which we spent trillions, really, rebuilding Europe after the devastation of the war. The International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, etc. All of these things were created in cooperation with the most enlightened minds of Europe, with the United States often in the lead and often funding it, of course, to create a new world order where this wouldn't happen. And from 1946 until Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, the peace held. Issues were worked out diplomatically. NATO guaranteed peace. For the United States, and this isn't just President Trump President Obama was doing some of this himself. The United States, the people of the United States are weary of our global responsibilities. It's ruinously expensive. It is true that many of our closest allies seem to be ungrateful at times. It is really true that some of our allies don't pay their fair share, etc. So I get why the American people are kind of fed up with that world order, because it does appear that the United States bears more burdens than it should have to bear, since it's their continent after all. I get all that. But what Robert Kagan reminds us is that this is a bargain. Whatever we're paying for world peace is the tiniest fraction of what world war looks like, or ethnic cleansing. And so if you want to get a sense of that, just look at Ukraine or just look at Gaza. That's what happens when you go to the pre-1946 world. And the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the invasion that led to this war in Ukraine shattered the settlement that occurred after World War II. And I think we're all bewildered, appalled to see that kind of gross artillery, the old style fighting. It's like it should be done in black and white, because it feels like, grainy footage from World Wars I and II. No one thought that was coming, but here it is. And I do blame the Obama administration for not getting stronger when Crimea was taken, because that emboldened Putin later to try to take much of or all of the rest of Ukraine. What's happening in Gaza is just so dispiriting to think, first of all, what happened on October 7th, 2 years ago, the killing of 1,300 Israeli people by Hamas, and then now the massive, bombastic, appalling retribution, where 40 or more thousand people of Gaza have been killed, men, women, and children. You look at the photographs, you can't even believe it. Looks like Berlin or Hiroshima. We stood by. More, we've supplied arms in retribution and shattering the lives of the Gazans, at least for the next 50 years. Who's going to rebuild Gaza? So the jungle grows back. The United States is the hegemon, has been. It has worked. If we pull back from our forward position in the world, David, and Mr. Trump has suggested that we might leave NATO. And if we stay in NATO, he said we might not support Article 5. And Article 5 says an attack on any NATO member is an attack on every NATO member. And we all must then come together to protect Poland or Lithuania or Latvia or Romania or the former GDR in Germany. If we pull back from that and say, well, it's their business in Europe, well, we know how that has gone for the past 500 years. And we know how successful the American security umbrella has been, however onerous it is and however expensive it seems. It's a bargain compared to what might follow. So I just fundamentally disagree with what's going on, and Congress is part of it, of course. It's not just President Trump. And he was elected. Let me just say, elections matter. We knew how he felt. We elected him. Elections matter. And so he's entitled, under the checks and balances system, to do what he can to fulfill his campaign pledges. But I am deeply fearful of the future of Europe, and therefore the future of the world. I'm frightened. I will tell you, I'm frightened of all of this. But we will see how it shakes out. And here's my optimism. I hope everyone listens to this carefully. I think that we will check some of this. I think that Europe will. I think that the American people will assert themselves about some of these issues. In other words, I think we still have a robust democracy, however much it's teetering. And I do believe in the long run that much of what President Trump is saying is bluff, or it's earnest but unlikely to succeed. I do think that a realignment is a good idea, but that should be done with careful and civil negotiation with our partners. Why is this government, this administration, so terrible to our allies and friends and cozying up to right-wing dictators instead? Two things. Because I know that there will be people listening to us who will be unhappy with this discourse, who will think that we're just talking standard old liberal crap, and that this is unfair and it politicizes the program unnecessarily and so on. And I feel very anxious about all of that. So I want people to know a couple of things. First of all, elections matter. Donald Trump served one term. He was out for a term. He's told us exactly what he wants to do in the world, and we reelected him. not only reelected him, but quite handily. And Congress appears, the Republicans, at least in Congress, who are the majority in both houses, appear to be willing to go along with almost all of it. That really is important. Elections matter. And number two, David, I believe that sometimes tough love is right. A shakeup. I think that I'm sort of channeling my inner Steve Bannon now, but sometimes you have to break the system in order to fix it. And I think with our gazillion $35 trillion national debt and the dysfunctions of America and the crime in the cities and the porous border and so on, I think that an argument can be made that there has to be a shakeup, and it has to be something of it has to be an upsetting and even in some ways violent shakeup for us to get out from under this paradigm that has been really bankrupting us in all sorts of ways, morally and economically. So those are two important caveats. In other words, I'm not saying that Trump should be impeached or blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying I'm sorry that it's uncivil. I'm sorry there's bullying. I'm sorry that we're turning on our allies without sitting down with them and really talking in a harmonious way about how to fix some of these problems. I'm sorry we're firing people in the federal bureaucracy without due process. Those things don't seem to me to be in the broad world of American practices and ideals. But I have to say, something had to give. The $30 trillion debt is going to eat the entire economy. And the bureaucracy has grown swollen, and it does have a regulatory capacity that really belongs to Congress, and so on. And so I'm not 100% against all of this. I'm mostly against the way it's being prosecuted.
What I was just going to get to is what gave me hope and the optimism I share with you is that this caused European leaders to step up, which I do think is a very positive element. 27 different nations came together following that meeting to try to figure out a way to support Ukraine, to figure out a way to supplant the United States support if that's the way things are going. And so that is an area where there are still people in the world that do that. Now, having said that, one of the ways to do that is to find between $800 billion and $1 trillion for an arms growth in Europe to support NATO, to support the Ukraine to support anyone who is opposing potential Russian aggression. That's a little scary in itself because it raises tension. The entire issue that really had occurred was Ukraine had given up their nuclear arms in exchange for the concept of global protection against any potential Russian aggression. And so that has been a troubling piece as part of this where we've struggled. But on the positive side, it does appear that there are others in the world who are willing to say, we're not quite ready for this complete new world order. Let's see if we can find something. So if we have to look for a silk purse out of the sow's ear, perhaps that is it.
Well, maybe. A couple of things. First of all, I really hate to see Europe rearming.
Yes.
You know, the American security umbrella, in which Europe basically said, we're counting on the U.S. to keep the peace, will have a military system, but it won't get swollen again, ever again. I hate to see that go. I hate to see Europe rearm when nations rearm, especially in a time when nationalism is on the rise. I think that we've done a mighty thing, you know, at a real sacrifice to our economy. We have stabilized a very troubled world, and there has been a period from 1946 until almost now of unprecedented world peace, not without appalling proxy wars and skirmishes and so on, Afghanistan, Iraq, don't get me wrong. But I hate to see the torch being passed, and I particularly hate to see it because there is another hegemon on the rise in the Far East called China. And while we sleep and talk about things not worth a moment's human attention, the latest thing that came out of the mouth of the president, the latest crisis, the latest fashion issue, the latest Hollywood scandal, we always do this as America. We have no staying power. We have no focus. We're indifferent to the rest of the world. And while we talk about the length of Donald Trump's ties or how many times he's been golfing, we're not talking about the rise of China, and we are going to pay a gigantic price for that sometime in the second half of the 21st century. And when it comes, people are going to say, why didn't you warn us? Why didn't you warn us? It's right there.
I think you're right. And I think there's a lot of challenges moving forward and a lot of opportunities and things that we will discuss further as we explore more of these issues on Listening to America. This has been another fascinating discussion, and it leaves us in an interesting place as we move forward. I think things are evolving quickly around us, and I think things are continuing to grow and change. I think we'll have to see where we are as we continue to move forward. And I always appreciate sitting down with you to put it into perspective.
I appreciate you, my friend, and again, The Jungle Grows Back, America and Our Imperiled World by Robert Kagan, and you can read my own proposals about our Cuba policy at listeningtoamerica.org. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America. All right. This week on Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, Thomas Jefferson and American Diplomacy and Trade. Guest host David Horton of Radford, Virginia, interviews the third president of the United States about his life as a diplomat. Jefferson served for 5 years as the American minister to the court of Louis XVI just before the French Revolution. Then he served for 3 years as America's first Secretary of State, trying to keep the United States from being drawn into the chaos of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. As president, Jefferson solved the problem of the Mississippi River by buying the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in 1803, and sent his protégé, Meriwether Lewis, to conduct an inventory of that vast territory that doubled the size of the United States. Jefferson was an admirer of Adam Smith. He believed that the less governments intrude into the free flow of goods and services in the world, the more efficient economies would be, and more prosperity would be the result. In the third segment of the program, David and I talk carefully about the trade, tariff, and foreign policy situation that has unfolded in the first months of the third segment.